It might feel lonely at times, but you are not alone. I speak about this openly so much on my social media, and that means that women speak to me about their journeys, and I can guarantee you that you are not alone in whatever you are experiencing on your trying to conceive journey. Hello and welcome! In today's video, I'm going to be discussing the benefits of tracking your cycle when trying to conceive. I am sharing as a major fertility nerd, but I'm also sharing from my own experience of having tried to conceive and having conceived multiple times while tracking my cycle. Not only did I track my cycle for myself, but I did so in real time on Instagram, and I continue to do so every single day. So if you want to track my cycle with me as a way to practically learn, you can follow my Instagram, and that's linked down below. A super quick disclaimer before I get into today's video, and that is that I share information, I potentially share some tips or suggestions or my experience, but none of that is advice. None of that is medical advice, definitely not medical advice. And also none of that is me telling other women what you should or shouldn't be doing. When I make a recommendation or a suggestion or something that worked for me and that doesn't resonate with you, please just take what serves you and leave what doesn't serve you. The other disclaimer is that I'm discussing the benefits of trying to conceive. So you're trying to make a baby, and we know how most of the time babies are made. So I'm going to talk about sex in this video. I'm going to say the word sex a lot in this video, and I just want to give you a heads up if you are uncomfortable hearing that word multiple times, because I'm going to say it a lot. And right off the bat of that disclaimer, I'm going to jump into the first benefit where I'm going to say the word sex a lot. Benefit number one is knowing what sex can lead to conception or pregnancy and what sex can't. Often the recommendation to couples who are trying to conceive is to have sex twice a week, every single week. And I'm sure that that is based on the assumption that couples don't know when the woman is ovulating, or that a woman doesn't know when she's ovulating, because not every single sex in your cycle can lead to conception or pregnancy. In other videos, I have detailed the fertile window when you can get pregnant, and outside of that fertile window, a person cannot get pregnant. And I think the benefit of knowing this, or one of the benefits of knowing this, is that you increase your odds of conception. Please don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that conception is as easy as knowing when your fertile window is or isn't. I just think that your odds are more likely if you're having sex in the time that it can lead to conception, and not expecting sex outside of your fertile window when it can't lead to conception to lead to pregnancy. I kind of picture this like someone kicking a ball at a goalpost, but if there's a gate in front of it, it definitely decreases your odds of getting the ball into that goalpost. But when it is wide open and there's no gate and there's no goalie, it definitely improves your odds of getting that ball into the goalpost. I think it also helps couples when you know if you had sex, whether that sex can lead to pregnancy or not. Because if you know that you had sex in a time where you were not fertile, you don't have to spend that entire cycle wondering if you are or aren't pregnant, because you know that that sex couldn't lead to conception. The second benefit that is very closely linked to the first benefit, but I wanted to separate it and discuss it as a benefit on its own, is that I believe that to some extent tracking your cycle when trying to conceive can enhance a couple's erotic life, or if it doesn't enhance it, can at least mitigate some of the burden that can potentially come with couples trying to conceive, the burden specifically on their erotic or their intimacy. I think knowing what sex can lead to conception and what sex can't lead to conception takes away that pressure of feeling the need to have sex twice a week, every single week of your cycle for however long you're trying to conceive. Then you can go from feeling pressure to have sex twice a week to having sex twice a week if you want to do that, and not because it is some kind of requirement for conception. When it comes to the erotic side of things or intimacy, I prefer quality over quantity. And I think when trying to conceive, it can quite easily become about the quantity or how often you've had sex. And that the quality of intimacy can sometimes be neglected when the primary purpose is conception, and pleasure or connection or intimacy between the two people becomes a secondary purpose of that sex. I'm not saying this definitely happens for all couples. I'm just saying that I think, having spoken to a lot of couples on their trying to conceive journey, I think that this can easily happen to couples. I am pretty outspoken on social media about constantly investing into the quality of my relationship and my marriage, because I think that the quality of my relationship impacts every aspect of my life. So why wouldn't I want it to be amazing? And the intimacy within my marriage is an important component thereof. I know this is a total side note, but if you're looking for an outstanding book for couples, specifically couples in a monogamous relationship, Mating in Captivity by Esther Perel is amazing. All right, back to the benefit. I personally found knowing when my fertile window was and knowing when I was not fertile was a benefit towards our erotic life when trying to conceive. I liked knowing that the 1 or 2 times we had sex in the fertile window could lead to conception, and that everything outside of that for the rest of the 23 days of my cycle, more or less, was for pleasure or connection or intimacy between us, and not about conception at all. I won't talk about it in this video, but across our cycles as women, there are things that impact on our sex drive, our just sex in general, or our erotic life, and I can make a video entirely dedicated to that. So there's other benefits in that department to tracking your cycle, but for this one, I'm just going to say that I think that it does mitigate against the negative impacts that can happen when trying to conceive when it comes to couples' sex life, and that it has the potential, when you track it, to not just mitigate that, but actually improve your intimate connection. Benefit number 3, I think tracking your cycle saves precious time when trying to conceive. And I'm saying precious time, and that might not be the case for everybody. Not everybody feels time constraints necessarily when they're trying to conceive, but I think that a lot of people do. In my case, we started trying to conceive when I was 29 years old. And I think that's different had I started trying to conceive when I was 19 years old. I think there's also, irrespective of your age, just a general time pressure when you really do want to be pregnant and it is taking a little bit longer than you thought it would take. Conception or pregnancy can sometimes take a while. Not always. For some people it happens quickly. For other people it takes longer. But I think one of the benefits, and I'm going to unpack it, about tracking your cycle when trying to conceive is I think it helps with some of the time things related to trying to conceive. So the first thing is that usually the going thing is that people say you should only go see a fertility specialist when you've been trying to conceive for 12 months without any success. I'm not necessarily in agreement with that. Obviously, I know that in some countries that is insurance dependent. The country that I live in, it's not insurance dependent. It's more just a suggestion that's given to couples. And an example that I think leads me to not necessarily agree with that is if you're tracking your cycle and you can see that you are not ovulating, would you really want to go through 12 months of not ovulating, where it can definitely not result in conception because you're not ovulating, before you go see a specialist who can potentially assist you with why ovulation is not taking place? Again, I also know that tracking your cycle is not 100% guarantee of anything. It can, for the most part, tell you if and when you're ovulating, but it can't necessarily tell you if you are releasing an egg. But if you're getting clear signs from your body that you're not ovulating at all, I personally wouldn't have wanted to wait 12 months before I go see somebody who can help me determine why I'm not ovulating. In another video, I spoke about how a cycle can be an indication of thyroid functioning, and it's a well-known thing that low thyroid functioning can impact on conception and pregnancy. So if you get that feedback from your cycle earlier on, as opposed to going through 12 months and then only having your thyroid tested, I think it saves time if you get an indication that potentially your thyroid is low and you go test it and you find out if it is or isn't low. And when I say go test something, I just mean if somebody wants to test it. There's lots of things that I picked up in my cycle that I didn't want to go for a test. I just decided to improve them through lifestyle and diet. And a lot of that is in my preconception video. Another thing that your cycle can tell you potentially is if you have low progesterone, because there's clear signs when you're tracking your cycle of low progesterone, and progesterone is vitally important for conception and sustaining a pregnancy. Again, I wouldn't want to wait 12 months before I get that information. So tracking your cycle can give you that feedback, and then you can opt to have your progesterone checked if you want to, or just generally work towards increasing your progesterone. So what I'm saying is that your cycle gives you information and you can decide what you do with that information. But if you track your cycle, you're likely to get that information sooner rather than going through, hypothetically, a whole 12 months before finding out that information, or finding out that you have certain barriers to your conception journey, and then only starting to implement things that removes those barriers. The fourth benefit of tracking your cycle is that I think it saves money in terms of testing. And in this one, I'm not going to talk about the medical or the fertility type of testing. I'll get back to that one in a different benefit. For this one, I'm talking about ovulation tests and pregnancy tests. I know that lots of women track their cycle through only the use of LH or ovulation tests. When I say ovulation test, it means LH test. And if I say LH test, it means ovulation test. By tracking your cycle purely through using that, it can become pretty expensive, especially for people who don't regularly ovulate in more or less the same time every single cycle, because then you're going to start taking LH tests quite early on in your cycle and potentially take them for 5 days, even 10 days, every single cycle that you're trying to conceive. And you might even do more than one LH test on a particular day, because you can have an LH surge that happens at night and by the next morning not show up on your LH test, and then you missed that LH surge by only testing once a day. So often people take an LH test twice a day for 5 to 10 days every single cycle. I guess depending on what country you live in and if you can buy bulk cheap LH tests, that's great, but where I live, LH tests can be pretty expensive. If you track your cycle using other markers like your cervical fluid and your temperature, you can narrow down the window of when you're likely to expect your LH surge, and then go from taking 5 to 10 LH tests to taking maybe 1 to 3 LH tests. I have played around with LH tests a lot even before we were trying to conceive. So I've been able to narrow it down to, I know that when my fertile window opens, how many days I can usually expect before I get my LH surge. So I've narrowed it down to 1 day where I know if I take an LH test in that day, I'm most likely to get my LH surge. And I use that information together with the rest of my markers when tracking my cycle, as opposed to using LH tests to determine when I'm ovulating. Now moving on to saving money in terms of pregnancy tests. So we conceived fairly quickly, and I'm not bragging when I say that. We've had our share of hardship on this journey, but the time to conceive has not been very long for us. Now, though we conceived very quickly multiple times, the first cycle we tried to conceive, we did not conceive. And I remember on that first cycle of trying to conceive, I spent a bunch of money on a bunch of different pregnancy tests, ranging from really cheap ones to really expensive ones, and I thought it would be a nice experiment to try all of them out in that cycle. Given that we did not conceive in that cycle, it ended up being a pretty expensive cycle. After that, I didn't again purchase expensive pregnancy tests with the mindset of doing an experiment with it, or with the mindset of doing a whole bunch of pregnancy tests. What I did do is I bought a bulk pack of cheaper pregnancy tests when I decided I wanted to see the progression lines that I'd seen on somebody else's YouTube video, and I thought that that would be cool to see. But then I bought really cheap ones. And buying really cheap ones and looking at the progression line served me for the 3 pregnancies that I did that. In the current pregnancy, when we conceived, I decided to get back to what is important to me or how I wanted to approach pregnancy or trying to conceive from the beginning. And that is to have my body tell me when we've conceived, as opposed to relying on early detection pregnancy tests. So for this current pregnancy, I did not take any pregnancy tests to confirm that I was pregnant. I confirmed that I was pregnant through tracking my cycle. And then I bought a pregnancy test to take purely for show on my Instagram. Anyway, what I've learned through my own trying to conceive journey is that you can rack up a high pregnancy test bill pretty quickly when you're trying to conceive, even if your trying to conceive journey is not very long. And tracking your cycle, you can either do like what I did with this pregnancy, where you don't rely on a test to tell you at all that you're pregnant. I mean, you can eventually take one like I did, or just not take one if you don't want to and just rely on your tracking markers. Or if you do want to take early detection tests or tests that can detect earlier, and you do want to do progression lines, you at least know from when pregnancy is possible, so that you don't waste money taking pregnancy tests when either pregnancy is not possible or it's not possible for it to show up on a pregnancy test yet. An example of this is that if you don't track your ovulation, you might think that your period is late when your period is perfectly on time for having a delayed ovulation. So you won't rush to take a pregnancy test thinking your period is 3 days late if you know that you ovulated later in that cycle, and you can expect your period to come a little bit later than it usually comes as a result of a delayed ovulation, not as a result of a potential pregnancy. Or even if there is a potential pregnancy, you'll know how many days past ovulation you are and when you can start taking a pregnancy test where it's even possible for the HCG levels to be high enough to show up on a pregnancy test. And in a similar realm, benefit number 5, if you track your cycle, especially if you track your cycle the way that I do with quite a detailed journal, you may be able to tell the difference between early pregnancy symptoms and just usual luteal phase or PMS. It is extremely common to symptom spot when you are trying to conceive. I think most people can agree on that. I'm sure there are exceptions to this. There are exceptions usually to everything. But most women I have spoken to symptom spot. So you look out for, is that likely a sign of an early pregnancy, or what is that? Is that telling me something? That's symptom spotting. And I remember with our first cycle of trying to conceive, I hectically symptom spotted and thought, you know, everything might potentially be an early pregnancy sign. And because I had detailed journals, there was one particular thing that happened and I was like, oh, I think this is different. And I went back on my journals and I saw that, no, it's not different. It's something that I've had in other cycles, and I made a note of it in other cycles. So I knew that that was not some unique sign in that particular cycle because I had previous data. Early pregnancy signs or things that you experience in your body are so similar to general things that you experience in your luteal phase. Your luteal phase is the time between ovulation and when you would generally expect your period, so the time where you get PMS. And that's because your body is literally preparing for pregnancy in that time. But because I had kept detailed records of my cycle, and because I've been so intentional about tracking my cycle when I actually got pregnant, I knew exactly this is different. This is something versus this is just what I can usually expect to experience in my luteal phase. So I think the benefit of tracking your cycle is that you can know what are your usual things that you experience. So instead of going to Google and Googling, is this an early sign of pregnancy? You'll be able to tell, is this usual for me to experience as opposed to somebody else's? Because what is an early sign of pregnancy for somebody else might just be a very normal luteal phase experience for you. So instead of seeking answers outside of your body or on the internet or from other people, you get to seek answers from your own body and get that understanding from yourself. And when you symptom spot, you can do the comparison to you which I think is more accurate than some other person or a random Google article that was written trying to understand what is PMS and what is early pregnancy. The next benefit, and I said that I would get back to this one, is I think you can have more focused fertility testing if fertility testing is something that you want to do or something you feel the need to do. I think that if you track your cycle, you're able to put your focus, your attention, your resources into tests that might serve you better than just having to randomly test for everything because you have no information about your cycle. Again, examples of this is, for example, if you're not ovulating, or if you want to have your thyroid tested, or if you want to have your progesterone levels tested. And not only does it help you focus what tests you want to run, it also lets you know when in your cycle is a good time to run those tests. For example, progesterone you want to measure after you've ovulated and before your period is due. Because if you measure it before ovulation, it's going to naturally be low. It only rises after ovulation. This is also the case, for example, if you want to have your lining measured. It's a good idea to decide, when do you want to have your lining measured? Do you want to have it measured right before ovulation so that you know that it is thick enough for implantation to take place? Or do you want to measure it in your luteal phase to know that once you've ovulated, it has gone thick enough for a successful conception to be possible? Another way that this might be helpful is if you have confirmed more or less through your cycle that you are ovulating regularly, you don't see any indicators of low thyroid functioning or any indicators of low progesterone, and it's taken a while to conceive, then you might decide that instead of starting with the female fertility test, you start with having a sperm analysis done. And this might be because you've ruled out some of the barriers from the female side for conception, and having a sperm analysis done is sometimes cheaper than the female tests that get done. And also, it's not an invasive test, where some of the female tests that get done are quite invasive or uncomfortable to do. I'm not trying to tell anybody what order fertility tests they should be doing or any of that. What I'm trying to say is that your cycle can give you information to decide where do you focus your resources. Because again, depending on where you live, fertility tests and or treatment, but I'm just speaking about the testing, can be very expensive. So for example, even if you're just going for an ultrasound to measure your lining, but you don't know when in your cycle you are and you have to return multiple times to measure your lining, you have to pay for multiple appointments, where if you knew what phase of your cycle you wanted to measure it in, and you know when you're in that phase of your cycle, you can go for one appointment as opposed to 3 or 4 appointments. The next benefit, and is closely linked to other things that I spoke about, but I want to speak about it in a different way, and that is the benefit of knowing if pregnancy is possible. And by possible, I mean when you are in that 2-week wait, or when you are in that time between ovulation and when your period is due, knowing whether or not you could potentially be pregnant in that time. Because by the time you can confirm pregnancy, you've already been pregnant for a little bit. And I'm not talking about when they calculate how pregnant you are and they take the 2 weeks before you ovulated as well, where it was most definitely not possible to be pregnant, but it's still counted as part of your pregnancy time. I'm speaking about the from ovulation up until when your period is due. Now, aside from maybe generally just relaxing if it is stressful for you for trying to conceive, if you know that it is not possible, I found it to be beneficial when I knew that we had had sex in the fertile window and there was a possibility of me being pregnant within the next 2 weeks before my period was due. And the benefit to that was I made certain choices or didn't do something because I knew there was a possibility of being pregnant. And I know that this is not everybody's choice. Some people will act exactly the same until they've confirmed pregnancy. But if you've seen my channel, you've seen preconception is very important to me. A lot of my health efforts are very important to me. So there were just some things I didn't want to do in those 2 weeks if I knew that pregnancy was possible. The latest example was I needed to have x-rays done for some routine thing, and I didn't want to have x-rays done if I knew that there was a possibility of me being pregnant at the time of those x-rays. So fortunately for me, my ovulation delayed and I anyway had the x-rays done before that 2-week period. But nonetheless, I still did ask them to put a lead thing in front of my uterus because I just felt more comfortable with that. And knowing, first of all, that my ovulation was delayed was helpful in making that decision. But secondly, if the x-ray had fallen in a time where I thought pregnancy or I knew pregnancy was possible, I might have made a different decision in terms of getting that x-ray altogether. And the benefit that I want to share, because I know that not everybody's going to make the same decision about getting an x-ray or not getting an x-ray, the benefit that I want to share is that the choice is yours, as opposed to finding out that you were pregnant and you did have an x-ray done in those 2 weeks before you found out that you were pregnant, and then you're worrying about whether or not it had an impact. I like being intentional with things. I like making an informed decision about things. So therefore, for me, it is a great benefit to know when pregnancy is or isn't possible in those 2 weeks. Another example, and again, I'm not judging anybody's choices around this. I'm just sharing a personal choice that I have made and that I like to make if I know, or like to not make if I know that pregnancy is possible. And that is alcohol consumption. Now, I'm not a regular alcohol consumer, but I do consume alcohol every now and again. And if I know that pregnancy is possible, I opt not to consume alcohol in that time. I'm not going to go into detail around that choice because, again, I'm not trying to sway anybody with a decision to consume alcohol or not to consume alcohol in the 2-week wait. It is just that that particular decision is not really around the what impact, generally speaking, does alcohol have on pregnancy. That one is for a health reason. It's because alcohol will put added pressure onto my liver, and if there's a possibility of me being pregnant, I would love for my body to prioritize that as opposed to dealing with the alcohol that I consumed. The next benefit is knowing how pregnant you are, how far along you are in your pregnancy if conception took place. I know lots of people who have gone for their first scan at more or less 8 weeks, so they think that they are 8 weeks pregnant based on the last date of their period, and they get to the scan and they're told no, they're actually only 6 weeks pregnant, or they experienced implantation bleeding and they think they're 8 weeks, but they're actually 12 weeks pregnant. This hasn't happened to me, but I can imagine that going for an 8-week scan and having somebody tell me that it is measuring small and only measuring at 6 weeks can be quite stressful. But if you know that you ovulated 2 weeks later, you will know that you are 6 weeks pregnant, go to that scan expecting to see a 6-week sized embryo, as opposed to thinking you're 8 weeks and then seeing a size of a 6-week embryo. So personally, I would just like to know how far along I am based on when I ovulated, not based on my last period, because you can have delayed ovulation, and that means that you will be less pregnant than you think that you are because you ovulated later if you're not tracking your cycle. I don't know if I explained that well, but the point is, if you're always only taking your last period, there's a high likelihood that your pregnancy dates are going to be incorrect if you do have an ovulation that happened earlier or later than the average of day 14 of the cycle. I think this is also very beneficial for taking pregnancy tests. Again, I know that I've already mentioned this, but if you don't know that your ovulation is delayed, you could think that your period is a week late or even 2 weeks late, where it's actually not late at all. Okay, the final benefit for this video, or the final benefit that I could think of at the time of filming this video, is I think there's a particular benefit for people who have irregular cycles who are trying to conceive to track your cycle. I think it is helpful to know whether you are or aren't ovulating, because if you have long cycles, either that cycle is long because you're not ovulating, or it's long because you're ovulating later in that cycle. And I think it is extremely beneficial to conception and knowing your conception journey if you know why your cycles are long. I think that it is quite difficult if you have irregular cycles to just go in blind and to not know at all whether this month there was a possibility of pregnancy see whether you ovulated this month, did you ovulate earlier or later, and you just kind of never know when your period is going to show up. So I think tracking your cycle is very beneficial to having some kind of pattern or routine amidst a irregular thing happening. It's also helpful that if you experience bleeding, you might be able to tell what kind of bleeding that is because of tracking your cycle instead of assuming that every type of bleed is a period. So for example, bleeding can be ovulation bleeding, it can be implantation bleeding, or it can be bleeding where there was no ovulation, or it can be a period as a result of ovulation having taken place. And when you track your cycle, you should more or less be able to determine what type of bleeding you are experiencing and know whether or not that is your period. And that is all of the benefits of tracking your cycle when trying to conceive that I could think of today. What I do want to say is that I recognize that there are a lot of benefits to tracking your cycle when trying to conceive, and I'm grateful that I have tracked my cycle for so long. But I do recognize that there is a fine line between conscious conception and tracking becoming something that is stressful or consuming your life when you're trying to conceive. In another video, I will discuss any tips that I can potentially share for you to derive the benefits of tracking your cycle when trying to conceive without it becoming a burden. Again, just a reminder that none of this was advice or medical advice. I'm just sharing from my experience and the information that I have in the hopes that it will be interesting to somebody or to some degree be valuable for you. If you are watching this and you're currently trying to conceive, I wish that I had words of comfort. I wish that I had words of strength. I wish that somehow through this video I could send some positivity your way, some strength your way, but I don't have the words for that. So all I can say is I do wish you the best with your trying to conceive journey, and just a reminder that it might feel lonely at times, but you are not alone. I speak about this openly so much on my social media, and that means that women speak to me about their journeys, and I can guarantee you that you are not alone in whatever you are experiencing on your trying to conceive journey. And no matter how long or how short it's been, no matter how many hardships or how few hardships you've experienced, I just want to say whatever you're experiencing is valid. It's okay if it is tough for you, or if you're sad from not having conceived after 1 month, or if it hasn't bothered you after conceiving for 6 months. I think that sometimes we lose our empathy when we compare ourselves to someone's situation who is potentially worse than what we perceive our situation to be. So I just want to say that all feelings around trying to conceive and where you are in your journey are completely valid, and I hope that a video like this just reminds you that you are not alone. Thank you for watching today's video, and if you enjoy this type of content, please remember to subscribe to my channel.